Can you sue terrorists in U.S. courts? The landmark Fuld v. PLO case. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you are watching from in the comment. It begins with a question so strange, so unthinkable, that most people never considered it. Can you sue terrorists in a U.S. courtroom? Not hunt them on a battlefield. Not pursue them with drones or military strikes. Not through international diplomacy or secret negotiations. But in a courtroom, a place of judges, juries, lawyers, and the rule of law. It sounds impossible. Sounds absurd. How can a grieving family walk into a federal court and say, "We want justice from terrorists"? And yet, that is exactly what happened. The case began not with lawyers, not with politicians, not even with the FBI. It began with a family, the Fuld family, a family scarred by an act of terror that happened thousands of miles away from American soil. But they were Americans, and under U.S. law, that fact mattered. It mattered more than anyone could have imagined, because their fight would drag one of the world's most infamous organizations into a U.S. courtroom, the Palestine Liberation Organization, better known as the PLO. For the first time, a terrorist-linked group would be forced to answer not on a battlefield, but in front of a jury. Years before the Fulds stepped into court, Congress passed a law. It was called the Anti-Terrorism Act of 1992. Most Americans never heard of it. It sat quietly in the U.S. Code, collecting dust. But buried inside that law was a promise to victims of terror. If you were an American citizen hurt by an act of international terrorism, you had a right. You could sue. You could drag the perpetrators into court. Not in Jerusalem, not in Ramallah, not in The Hague, but here, in the United States. It sounded almost ridiculous. How could an American jury in New York decide the fate of foreign terrorist groups? How could a family collect damages from organizations backed by militants and foreign powers? No one thought it would actually work, until the Fulds tried. The story begins in the summer of 2002. Jerusalem, a city ancient and scarred, holy to millions, but also soaked in blood. On a crowded day, a suicide bomber boarded a bus. It was filled with ordinary people, students, workers, fathers, mothers, children. Among the victims was Yaron Fuld. He was not just another name. He was a brother, a son, a husband, and he was also connected to the United States, part of a family that would not stay silent. When the bomb went off, lives were shattered. The streets were filled with screams. Sirens cut through the chaos. Bodies covered with sheets. Blood staining the pavement. For most families, grief would stay in Jerusalem. But for the Fulds, grief traveled across the ocean. All the way to America, the Fulds mourned. They buried Yaron. They cried. They raged. But then, they turned to an idea no one else had tried. They wanted more than mourning. They wanted accountability. And in America, accountability sometimes comes with a price tag. Billions of dollars. If they could convince a jury that the PLO and its affiliates supported the attack that killed Yaron, they could do the unthinkable. They could bankrupt a terrorist group. Justice, not through guns, not through war, but through law. It sounded crazy, but crazy was all they had left. To understand the risk, you have to understand the target. The Palestine Liberation Organization was not some small group hiding in caves. It was powerful. It had offices. It had diplomats. It had political recognition around the world. But it also had blood on its hands. For decades, the PLO had been accused of terror attacks, hijackings, assassinations, bombings. To some, they were freedom fighters. To others, they were terrorists. To the Fuld family, they were the reason Yaron was dead. And now the Fulds were going to drag them into an American courtroom. Lawyers laughed at the idea. How do you serve legal papers on a group like the PLO? Do you mail it to their office? Do you knock on their door in Ramallah? And even if you get them into court, how do you make them pay? But the Anti-Terrorism Act made something clear. U.S. courts had jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is power. The Fulds had power. A tiny sliver of power against a massive enemy. And so the lawsuit was filed. Fuld v. PLO. A case that sounded like fiction. A case that reporters didn't believe at first. A case that would become a headline around the world. Imagine the scene. A federal courtroom in New York. American flags hanging on the walls. A jury sitting quietly, not sure what to expect. Lawyers lining up their arguments. On one side, a grieving American family. On the other side, representatives of a group accused of supporting terror. It was surreal. It was historic. And it was just the beginning, because what happened in that courtroom would shake governments. It would terrify organizations that thought they were untouchable. It would force the world to ask a question it had never asked before. Can America put terrorism on trial? At first glance, it looked like a private lawsuit. Just one family, one tragedy. But the stakes were enormous. If the Fulds won, the door would open. Other families could sue. Hundreds of victims of terror could demand damages. Terrorist groups could lose millions, even billions. The war on terror would not just be fought with soldiers. It would be fought with subpoenas, with juries, with verdicts. The Fulds were not just seeking justice for themselves. They were changing the battlefield. The courtroom doors had not even opened, and already history was pressing down. The Fulds knew they were stepping into a fight bigger than themselves. Governments would watch. Terrorists would watch. Victims would watch. One verdict could rewrite the rules. With a question no one had ever asked. A question that would echo through the halls of justice, through the headlines of newspapers, and across the world. The air was heavy that morning. Jerusalem, the eternal city, was restless. Markets buzzed. Children hurried to school. Buses roared down narrow streets. It looked ordinary, felt ordinary, but beneath the surface it was not. The year was 2002. The Second Intifada was raging. Explosions, shootings, clashes, violence seemed to erupt without warning. And on this day, the city would bleed again. It was a typical commuter bus. Old, crowded, the seats filled with workers, students, families. Some carried groceries. Some carried books. Some carried nothing but the exhaustion of daily life. And among them was Yaron Fuld. Yaron was not looking for danger. He was not a soldier that day. He was just living life like anyone else. He sat quietly, unaware that death was already on board. At the back of the bus sat another passenger. He looked ordinary too. Nothing unusual. No one paid attention. But hidden beneath his clothes was death. Strapped to his body, a suicide bomb, wires, nails, explosives, all waiting for a single push. His orders were clear. Kill as many as possible. Turn an ordinary bus into a massacre. And in a few minutes, that's exactly what would happen. It happened fast. Flash. A roar. Then fire. The bus ripped apart. Windows shattered into razor shards. Metal twisted like paper. Screams drowned in the thunder. People were thrown into the air. Bodies slammed against seats and steel. Some died instantly. Others clung to life in a nightmare of smoke and blood. The street outside turned into chaos. Shouts, sirens, people running, stumbling, crying. Jerusalem had seen bombings before, but each one felt like the first. Each one felt like the end of the world. When the smoke cleared, names began to emerge. One of them was Yaron Fuld. He was gone. Just like that, a life erased in seconds. His family shattered. His community stunned. His name added to the growing list of victims of terror. But for the Fulds, Yaron was not just a statistic. He was flesh and blood. He was laughter. He was memory. He was love. And now he was gone. The scene of the bombing was unbearable. Blood covered the pavement. Shoes scattered. School bags abandoned. A child's doll burned at the edges. Reporters swarmed. Camera crews broadcast images of twisted wreckage to the world. Viewers sat in living rooms in America, Europe, and beyond watching horror unfold. But for the families, it wasn't just a broadcast. It was personal. It was raw. It was permanent. The Fulds buried their son. The sound of dirt hitting the coffin echoed like gunfire. Each thud a reminder that terrorism had stolen him forever. Grief was one thing, but grief often carries something else with it. Rage. The Fulds were consumed. How could this happen? Why did their loved one have to die in a bus bombing thousands of miles from home? And why did no one stop it? It was not enough to mourn, not enough to light candles or whisper prayers. They wanted accountability. The bomber was dead, but the bomber was not the only one responsible. Someone planned this. Someone paid for it. Someone trained him. Someone celebrated after he blew himself up. And the Fulds wanted names. They wanted those names dragged into the light. Behind almost every suicide bombing in that era, there were networks, organizations, leaders, money trails. This was not random violence. This was orchestrated, calculated, funded. The Fulds began asking questions. Who gave the orders? Who supplied the explosives? Who rewarded the bomber's family afterward? And the answers pointed to a familiar name: the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO had long been accused of financing, supporting, and glorifying attacks just like this one. Their fingerprints were on the infrastructure of terror. Even when they denied it, the accusations never stopped. And now, the Fulds believed the PLO was tied to Yaron's death. At first, the Fulds grieved like any family. But grief transformed. It became determination. It became a mission. They would not let Yaron's death fade into memory. They would not let it be forgotten, another statistic in a bloody conflict. Instead, they would take a step no one had taken before. They would use the power of law. They would sue. Why America? Why not Israel? Why not international courts? Because the Fulds had something most victims didn't. They had U.S. citizenship. That fact opened a door that most never knew existed. A door hidden in American law. The Anti-Terrorism Act of 1992. This law gave American victims of international terrorism the right to sue in U.S. courts. It was designed for moments exactly like this. But no one had truly tested it. No one had dared to drag a group like the PLO before a jury in New York. Until now, the Fulds began reaching out to lawyers. Some dismissed the idea outright. It sounded absurd. How do you bring terrorists into a U.S. courtroom? How do you serve them legal papers? How do you make them pay damages? But the Fulds didn't stop. They kept pushing. They kept asking. And slowly, the impossible started to look possible. Because law is strange. Law is patient. Law is powerful in ways bullets are not. And the Fulds were about to transform their grief into a legal weapon. The bombing shocked Israel. But the lawsuit that followed shocked the world. The headlines spread. American family sues PLO for terrorist attack. Governments paid attention. Terrorist groups paid attention. Victims' families around the world paid attention. Could it really be done? Could you actually sue terrorists in a U.S. courtroom? The Fulds were determined to find out. Something changed after Yaron's death. It wasn't just another bombing. It became a symbol. For years, victims of terrorism were told there was no justice, that the attackers were dead, that the organizations behind them were too powerful, that international politics made accountability impossible. But now, a family from America was saying otherwise. They were saying, "We will not let this go." And with that decision, history began to shift. The attack was brutal, but what followed was stranger still. Blood spilled in Jerusalem, but justice would be sought in New York. A grieving family would fight a political organization. A courtroom would become a battlefield, and a verdict could shake the world. The bus explosion was the spark, but the fire had just begun. Chapter 2 ends with silence. The smoke from the bombing has cleared. The coffins are buried. The tears are shed. But the story is not over. It is only beginning, because the Fulds are no longer just victims. They are plaintiffs. They are challengers. They are fighters in a courtroom war unlike any before. The bus bombing asked a brutal question. Who is responsible? For more chilling true crime stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. The explosion in Jerusalem was over. The smoke had cleared. The bodies buried. The headlines faded. But for the Fuld family, the story was just beginning. Grief had turned to fire. fire had turned to resolve. They wanted justice, but not just in prayer, not just in memory. They wanted it in a courtroom, and that decision would drag them into one of the strangest battles in legal history. Can you sue terrorists? It sounded insane. How do you put a terror group in the defendant's chair? How do you make them answer? They live in shadows. They hide in bunkers. They laugh at subpoenas. But the Fuld family had something others didn't. They had a key. The Anti-Terrorism Act of 1992. A quiet law, passed in Washington, D.C., almost forgotten. But inside it was a weapon. It allowed Americans harmed by terrorism overseas to sue those responsible, right in U.S. courts. No one had really used it. No one had tested it. Until now. At first, lawyers told the Fulds no. Impossible. Unwinnable. Don't waste your time. Terrorists were not corporations. They didn't fear lawsuits. They didn't care about judgments. They weren't going to sit politely in front of a jury. But the Fulds pressed. They knocked on doors. They made phone calls. They told your own story again and again. Until finally, they found attorneys who believed. These lawyers weren't just chasing money. They wanted something bigger. They wanted to prove that law could be a battlefield too. The target was clear: the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO was not just a name. It was a symbol. Decades of conflict. Decades of blood. An organization accused again and again of supporting attacks like the one that killed your own. They had offices. They had representatives. They had diplomats. Unlike shadowy cells hiding in caves, the PLO had a face in the world. And that meant they could be reached. They could be served. They could be dragged into a courtroom. At least that was the theory. The lawsuit was filed in a U.S. federal court. The headline stunned the world. American family sues PLO for terror attack in Jerusalem. This was not a small claim. This was not symbolic. The Fulds wanted damages. Real money. Hundreds of millions. It wasn't just about cash. It was about responsibility. About showing the world that organizations funding terror would pay a price. The courtroom was now the new front line. The PLO laughed at first. A lawsuit in America? Against them? Ridiculous. Their lawyers argued it had no basis. That U.S. courts had no power over them. That this was politics dressed as justice. But as motions flew back and forth, something became clear. The law was on the Fuld side. The Anti-Terrorism Act gave them standing. The court had jurisdiction. The case would move forward. For the first time in history, a terror-linked group faced the terrifying possibility of answering to a jury of ordinary Americans. But the Fulds also knew the risk. If they lost, it would be more than defeat. It would set a precedent. It would tell the world, you cannot sue terrorists in America. It would slam the door on every victim who might come after them. The pressure was enormous. One wrong move, and they could ruin the future of terror litigation forever. But they pressed on. Imagine it. On one side, grieving families, ordinary people in dark suits, photographs of loved ones held close. On the other side, attorneys representing the PLO, polished, confident, armed with political arguments, international law, and claims of immunity. The contrast was stark. One side spoke of blood on buses. The other side spoke of sovereignty and politics. The jury listened. The judge frowned. The world watched. The Fulds' lawyers brought evidence. Documents. Intelligence reports. Witnesses. They showed that the bus bombing was not random. That the bomber did not act alone. That networks of support existed. Money flowed. Training was given. Families of attackers were rewarded. They pointed directly at the PLO. The lawyers painted a picture of an organization not just fighting a war, but supporting terrorism as a strategy. Every nail in the bomber's vest, every dollar in his pocket, every message of celebration afterward, they argued it all traced back. The PLO's lawyers pushed back hard. This is politics, not law. We are not responsible for every act. You cannot hold us liable for individuals. They argued jurisdiction. They argued fairness. They argued immunity. At times, it seemed the case would collapse under technicalities. But each time, the Fuld's attorneys fought back. They reminded the court why they were there. A bus exploded, people died, and someone had to answer. The jury was ordinary Americans, teachers, clerks, office workers. Most had never set foot in Israel. Most had never heard of your own Fuld. But now they sat in judgment over an international conflict. The weight was heavy. Every word they heard carried global consequences. Were they deciding a case or rewriting the rules of international justice? The line was blurred. The Fuld's lawyers knew they couldn't just drown the jury in geopolitics. They had to tell a story. So they told your own story. They told the story of a man on a bus, of a family torn apart, of children growing up without a father, of a wife left in silence. They made the jury feel the explosion. They made them hear the screams. They made them see the blood. It wasn't just about Israel. It wasn't about politics. It was about one family's loss. And the organization that, they argued, made it happen. Slowly, the case shifted. The PLO's lawyers grew uneasy. The evidence piled up. The emotional weight pressed harder. And then came a turning point. The judge ruled that the case would not be dismissed. The trial would move forward. This was history. For the first time, a terrorism case against the PLO would be heard before a U.S. jury. The door was now wide open. The news rippled worldwide. Victims of terror watched closely. Governments bristled. Diplomats whispered in panic. If the Fulds won, it would set a precedent that terrified every group linked to violence. It meant that American victims of overseas terror could drag organizations into U.S. courts and strip them of millions. And not just once. Over and over again. The battlefield was shifting. But for the Fulds, it wasn't just law. It was raw pain. Every day in court meant hearing the bombing described again. Every exhibit was another wound reopened. Every testimony was another night relived. They carried Yaron's picture. They carried his memory. They carried their grief like armor. And they refused to back down. At one point, the judge gave a warning. "This case is extraordinary," he said. "It will not be easy. It will not be quick. And the world is watching." He was right. The case was more than legal. It was symbolic. It was a test. Could victims of terrorism force justice out of shadows and into the light? The answer was not clear. Not yet. By the close of Chapter 3, the battle lines are drawn. The Fulds have launched the impossible. The PLO has been dragged into court. The jury is waiting. The world is watching. A bus exploded in Jerusalem. Now a courtroom in New York will decide what that means. The question is no longer, can you sue terrorists? The question is, will you win? The gavel struck. The trial began. For the first time in American history, a terror-linked organization was on trial before an ordinary jury. Not in the Middle East. Not in a secret tribunal. But in a U.S. courtroom. The stakes? Immense. The Fulds weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting to prove that the law itself could stand against terrorism. The courtroom was tense, packed with reporters. Victims' families sat quietly, holding photographs of the dead. On the other side, lawyers for the PLO sat sharp and polished. They weren't here to mourn. They were here to win. Every eye watched the judge. Every word carried weight. This wasn't just a case. It was a battlefield. The Fulds' attorneys spoke first. They told a story. A bus, a bomber, family shattered. They painted the bombing not as random, but as orchestrated, planned, financed, supported. They pointed to the PLO. They said, "This organization made terror possible." Then came the defense. The PLO's lawyers stood tall. "This is politics," they argued. "This is a courtroom, not a battlefield. We do not control every act of violence." They tried to shift blame. They tried to make the jury doubt. The clash was clear. One side spoke of blood. The other spoke of politics. Witnesses took the stand. Experts traced financial trails. Intelligence officers explained terror networks. Former insiders described how money flowed through channels. Every document told a story. Every transfer had a destination. And again, the line pointed back. The Fuld's attorneys hammered. The bomber didn't act alone. He was backed. He was supported. He was rewarded. Then came the voices that broke the jury's composure. Survivors of the bus bombing. Families who lost loved ones. They spoke in trembling voices. They described the blast, the fire, the silence after. Some jurors cried. Even the judge shifted uncomfortably. The human cost was undeniable. This wasn't just evidence. This was pain laid bare. But the defense was relentless. They argued sovereignty. They argued immunity. They argued that America had no business judging a conflict overseas. They brought experts of their own. They claimed the PLO was pursuing peace. That rogue actors, not leadership, were behind the violence. They tried to drown the jury in politics, in international law, in technicalities. Sometimes it seemed to work. Some jurors looked confused. The case was heavy, complex, global. The judge walked a fine line. He reminded the jury, this case is about law, not politics. He ruled on objections. He struck arguments that wandered too far. But he also allowed enough room for both sides to breathe. The balance was delicate. One wrong move and the entire trial could collapse. For the Fulds, the pros were clear. They had human stories that touched hearts. They had a U.S. law written for their cause. They had evidence linking money and support. But the cons were dangerous. Terror cases are messy, filled with politics. Proving direct responsibility is nearly impossible. If they lost, they might close the door for all future victims. For the PLO, the pros were also real. They had resources, money, and powerful lawyers. They could argue immunity and jurisdiction. They could claim the case was unfairly political. But their cons were damning. Public sympathy was against them. The jury could be swayed by emotion. Evidence of financial ties was hard to ignore. The battlefield was balanced. Any side could fall. At one point, the defense made a bold claim. They said, "There is no proof the PLO leadership ordered this attack." The Fuld's attorney rose. He didn't shout. He didn't rant. He simply held up a document. It showed payments made to the family of the bomber. Direct, recorded, unmistakable. The courtroom froze. The defense stammered. The jury leaned forward. It was a blow they could not easily explain away. Outside the courthouse, cameras rolled. Headlines blared. Families face off with terror in court. Historic trial against PLO. Commentators argued on TV. Some said this was justice. Others said it was political theater. But one thing was clear. The whole world was watching. And that meant the jury felt the weight. Weeks of trial came to an end. The Fuld's attorneys rose one last time. They reminded the jury of the blood, of the bus, of the faces of the dead. They said, you can make history. You can send a message. You can show that law is stronger than terror. Then came the defense. They warned of politics invading justice. They said, this is not America's fight. They urged the jury to let the PLO go. The air was thick. Every word mattered. The jury left to deliberate. They were ordinary people. But in their hands lay history. Could they find the PLO responsible? Could they put a dollar value on lives lost? Could they balance justice and politics? The questions haunted them. Hours passed, then days. The nation waited. And then, a knock at the courtroom door. The jury had reached a decision. The room filled. The families held their breath. The defense sat still. The clerk rose. The judge nodded. The verdict was about to be read. The room was silent. So silent that even the shuffle of papers sounded like thunder. The jury had returned. 12 ordinary Americans. 12 people carrying the weight of history. The judge looked down. His gavel struck once. All rise. The families stood. The reporters raised their pens. The cameras outside hummed. This was it. The end of weeks of testimony. The end of years of waiting. The clerk took a piece of paper. Hands trembling. Voice steady. In the case of Fuld versus Palestine Liberation Organization, the air seemed to vanish. The words came sharp. We, the jury, find the defendants liable. The courtroom gasped. Some cried, some shouted, some simply froze. The jury had decided. The PLO and Palestinian Authority were found responsible. Not just politically, but legally. The damages? Massive. Over $655 million. The Fulds embraced. Tears streamed down their faces. For them, it wasn't about money. It was about validation. It was about recognition. They had stood against terror and won. Across the aisle, the PLO's attorneys stiffened, their faces pale. They knew what this meant. It wasn't just a loss. It was precedent. It was danger for every other group accused of terror. News broke instantly. U.S. jury slams PLO. Families win historic terror case. Justice in New York courtroom. Commentators called it a turning point. Some called it justice. Others called it dangerous. Foreign governments protested. They said America was interfering in global conflicts. They warned it would destabilize peace talks. But for the victims' families, none of that mattered. For the first time, they felt heard. Outside the courthouse, families lit candles. They held photographs. They whispered prayers. But behind the joy was a question. Would this verdict stand? Everyone knew the PLO would appeal. Everyone knew the fight wasn't over. Justice had come. But would it last? The PLO's lawyers filed immediately. They argued jurisdiction again. They argued the jury had been swayed by emotion. They argued America had no right to punish foreign leaders. And slowly, the appeals court listened. The families fought back. They begged the judges not to erase the verdict. They begged the court to respect the jury's courage. But the appeals court was cold, detached, focused only on law. And then, a crushing blow. The verdict was overturned. The Fulds were devastated. After years of fighting, the victory had slipped away. Justice, once so close, was gone. Reporters asked how they felt. They said, "We feel betrayed." They said, "Our loved ones were killed, and the law just turned its back." For them, it was worse than losing. It was like winning, then having the win stolen. The reversal sparked fire. Critics called it cowardice. They said American courts had bowed to politics. They said justice had been denied. Others said it was necessary, that courts couldn't hold foreign governments hostage, that diplomacy had to survive. The world was split. Justice versus politics. Law versus diplomacy. The debate burned for years. Even with the reversal, the case mattered. Proved something powerful. That families could stand up. That terror could be challenged in a courtroom. It showed the world a possibility. Path. A weapon made not of guns, but of law. And it left a question burning. If not here, where? If not now, when? The Fulds never gave up. They continued speaking. They told their story in interviews. They pressured lawmakers. They wanted to make sure no family would have to feel the same betrayal. They wanted laws made stronger. They wanted courts made braver. Their fight became larger than themselves. It became a symbol. Even now, lawyers study the case. Professors teach it. Judges remember it. It was a warning, precedent, a glimpse into the future of law. Because the question never went away. Can you sue terrorists in U.S. courts? The answer? Yes. But the victory may not last. The night Lauren Fuld's family buried her, they never imagined a courtroom would one day carry her name. They never imagined history would bend around her memory. The fight left scars. The verdict gave hope. The reversal gave pain. But the story isn't finished. Because every new case, every new victim, every new family that dares to fight, carries the torch. The law may stumble. It may fall. But as long as families like the Fuld stand, the fight will never end. And one day, perhaps, justice will not just flicker in a New York courtroom. It will burn across the world. For more chilling true crime stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel.